inquiring into the fourth foundation of mindfulness, these universal categories of phenomena known as the Dhammas. And as we discussed in the last video, these categories are laid out as a means of transmuting the doctrine, the Dharma, into direct perception, direct knowing. And this teaching starts with singling out and highlighting what's known as the 5 hindrances. And these are mental factors that hinder progress in our meditation and in our daily lives. And by now we start seeing a theme that runs through the foundations. So let's start with a brief recap and see if we can connect the dots. So in the first foundation we explored the body, and from there we saw how in the second foundation, Vedana, there are these sensations in the body, and how our reactions to these painful and pleasurable sensations conditions craving and aversion in the mind, and how ignorance leads to confusion. And in the third foundation, Chitta, we explored these mental states further, and we saw how these poisons of anger and aversion and confusion are reinforced, and we kind of looked into them in more detail. We also saw how a lack of mindfulness can cause, on the one hand, a sort of sloth and torpor, this inward collapse of lack of energy, and on the other hand, an agitated mind that is restlessly searching, jumping around uncontrollably, the monkey mind. This is the hindrance of agitation, restlessness, and worry. So why is so much emphasis placed on these hindrances? Well, for the simple reason that they get in our way. They get in the way of our well-being, they get in the way of our meditation, they hinder us from relaxing and finding concentration and equanimity, and we know this experientially. We know that it's impossible to sink into a meditative state of absorption when we're caught in these mental states. So we really need to know how to relate to them. And so in this part of the teaching, they are really singled out as a way to address them and to work with them more directly. So let's look at how we do that. So in the discourse, the Buddha lays out 5 steps or ways of working with the hindrances. And the first is simply to be aware when they are present in us, because we cannot change what we're not aware of. So first, we really need to become familiar with them. We need to see how they alter our perception and hinder us from seeing clearly. So let's start with kind of going through each of the 5 hindrances, and as we do, I invite you to also reflect on how they show up in your life. So the first hindrance is desire, lust, clinging, attachment, craving, greed. And this has the quality of being caught in the grip of lust, as we talked about, this poison of mind. It's based on the incessant searching after sensory pleasure. And it carries the seed of addiction. There's a sense of narrowing, of entrapment, of getting caught, getting stuck. And the Buddha used an analogy here which I think is helpful. So you can imagine your mind as a bowl of water, clear water. And then we can imagine how each of the hindrances has a particular way of distorting the water, of altering our perception, of kind of confusing the mind in various ways. So desire is like pouring dye into the water. You know, whether we are thirsting after food or pleasure or sex or recognition or even spiritual attainment, our mind tends to fixate on the object of our desire, and then our entire vision and our entire perception of reality gets colored by it. So desire has the quality of drawing us into a trap. And by contrast, the hindrance of aversion or hatred has more the quality of pushing away, of fighting. It's as if, you know, the water is boiling, right? There's a violent heat, the fire of anger that obscures our vision. And this tendency of mind is rooted in the poison of anger and hatred, right? So as we look closer, we begin to see that even subtle expressions of this, like small irritations or aversions, actually carry the seed of ill will, really, this hatred. The mind state of sloth and torpor is like the water is overgrown with algae. There's stagnation, there's no movement, there's no energy in the mind. And when this quality is present, we find ourselves often lacking will. We lack motivation. We find ourselves unable to channel our energy, to make effort, or to stay concentrated. Restlessness and worry, on the other hand, is more like wind-swept water. Like there's turbulence, there's a strong wind, and our mind is turbulent. Our attention is tossed around uncontrollably. We find it very difficult to settle down, to be focused and calm and stable and grounded. And finally, doubt. It's like the water is full of dirt. There's a muddy water. Everything is kind of confused and mixed together, and we find it really difficult to see clearly. There's often a lack of trust, there's doubt, there can be confusion, second guessing, and there's a sense of not getting anywhere, like going around in circles and staying in this web of confusion. So before we move further, it's important to point out that these hindrances are not meant as moral judgment. We may hear them as being bad or wrong, and we so easily make the jump to feeling that we are doing something wrong or that we are bad for having them. But this is simply not the case. For example, we may sit down to meditate and we find the mind agitated and restless, and we find it hard to concentrate, and we feel like, what am I doing wrong? Right? We start judging ourselves, and we may even start to identify with the judgments. Like, why can't I even focus on the breath? What's wrong with me? And I can't seem to do anything right, and so on. But this inner criticism, which is so strong in many of us, it's just another form of aversion, right? It's just like adding fuel to the flame, right? So rather than fighting or repressing the hindrances or judging ourselves for having them, we begin by becoming aware of their presence. And we simply note what's happening. There is confusion in me, there's anger, there's criticism, there's judgment, whatever it is. So we drop the moral judgment and we start seeing things for what they are. This is clear seeing, vipassana. And I had this experience personally where for the longest time I was holding the belief that anger was bad or ugly. And since I don't want to be bad or ugly, I tried to distance myself from anger. Anger is not welcome. Any sign of anger is either repressed or projected outside so that my self-image could be, maintained as a non-aggressive person. But the problem with disowning parts of ourselves in this way is that we push it into the unconscious, into what Carl Jung called the shadow. In other words, the anger, it remains intact. It resides in the shadow until we're able to face it and start integrating it. And not only is the anger there, but it remains out of reach. So we have no conscious control over it and how it erupts or how it manifests in our lives. So in a way, the path includes a type of what we might call shadow work, right? Instead of running away, we learn to stop and invite the difficulties. We face them with gentleness and care. We hold them with compassion. And over time, we start seeing these hindrances as a natural occurring part of our human conditioning. And we learn to work with them rather than against them. So back to my example, by repressing the anger, I was also repressing the energy behind that anger, right? By not being able to meet that energetic charge, I was in a way cut off from the life force that was caught up in the anger. So in a way, the path remains blocked until we're able to address the obstacle, right? This is the point of working with the hindrances. And in the Tantric teachings and in Vajrayana and Tibetan Buddhism, for example, they talk about inner alchemy. This is the process of transmuting the energy that is caught up in defilements. We engage them rather than avoid them, right? And we learn to use, in a way, the hindrances as fuel for the inner journey, even. Right? They even talk about eating the poison, right? So in a sense, the hindrances aren't really hindrances at all. We can even go as far as to say that working with the hindrances is what defines the spiritual path. In Zen, they sum it up beautifully with the phrase, the obstacle is the path, right? Because real strength lies in the ability to integrate the parts that have been cut off, right? So that we can embody all aspects of our humanity. So by turning to the hindrances with mindfulness, we get to know their various qualities and effects on the mind. And as we become familiar with them, their presence becomes unmistakable. We feel the taste of restlessness or anger or agitation or whatever it is as soon as it arises. And at first, these states may feel like permanent residents in the mind, but as our mindfulness increases, we begin to see that they are more like visitors. And this leads to the second step in the instruction, which is to become aware of when the mind is free from these hindrances. So we learn to stop and to notice when they're not present, right? And these are moments of peace that really provide a taste of the fruit of our practice, and they strengthen our motivation to keep going. And by really paying attention to these glimpses, we begin to rewire our neural circuits. It's like installing a new operating system in our brain, essentially. And what begins as short moments or glimpses of freedom, over time becomes more and more of the natural way of being for us. So we install this habit of what Rick Hanson calls taking in the good. Right? It's like savoring that freedom. And we cultivate the mind that is free from defilements. And it's not really that we have to do something or to produce some higher states. We simply have to let the water settle and the mind becomes naturally clear. The third step in the instruction is knowing the causes for these hindrances to arise. This means understanding the conditions that give rise to craving or aversion or confusion or whatever it is. Because as long as these conditions are there, the hindrances will keep manifesting. This is the essence of the doctrine known as dependent origination or conditioned co-arising, which it basically says that all things arise in dependence on other things. There's always a cause for something to arise. And we cannot be free from suffering, for example, as long as the causes and conditions for suffering are there. They go together. So another example that is familiar by now is how craving and aversion arises from the unconscious reactions to our likes and dislikes. Right? So we experience something we don't like, there's an unpleasant sensation, and we react with aversion. We think we're reacting to the situation, but in fact we're reacting to the unpleasant sensation in the body that arises as a response to the situation. So as long as we keep reacting to our likes and dislikes in this way, we keep watering the seeds of anger, aversion, and craving and clinging. And what happens is that over time, we just reinforce these habits until they become automatic. When we're children, we may scream for that toy or that ice cream. And although over the years, our expression becomes more subtle and sophisticated, hopefully, the strategy largely remains the same. We have the mistaken belief that happiness comes from the fulfillment of our desires. We are trained and highly skilled at seeking pleasure in order to meet our desires. And there are these strong market forces too that benefit from increasing our passion, our cravings, our desires, basically. And so we think that the next high or the next thing or the next relationship, that will be the thing that finally makes us happy, and so that we can relax and stop searching. And the reason this keeps on going is because there is temporary gratification. It feels good for a while, but it doesn't ultimately work. It's not what makes us happy in the end. And we know this at some level, and over time we see it more and more experientially. but we keep going out of sheer momentum of these habits. So breaking these patterns of reactivity and cultivating equanimity, it really takes practice. And the point is that we get good at what we practice, whether it's mindfulness or reactivity. And the Buddha summed this up in the phrase, whatever you frequently think and ponder upon, that will become the inclination of your mind. And we see this pattern playing out in our behavior, we see it in the mind, we see it in the brain through neuroplasticity, we even see it in nature through what biologist and biochemist Rupert Sheldrake called morphic resonance. That once something happens once, it becomes increasingly likely that it will happen again. And this is the pattern both in the mind and in the physical universe. So through mindfulness, we learn to stop and to investigate our beliefs. We gain insight into the workings of the mind, the power of our habits, and the causes for the hindrances to arise. And over time, this affords us to start deconditioning the mind and to build new habits that give us access to deeper levels of happiness. Happiness that is not dependent on the fulfillment of our desires. Happiness that is inherent, actually, in our being. The fourth step is about knowing how a hindrance can be removed once it has arisen. In other words, what are the causes for hindrances to disappear? Now, in the time, in ancient India, in the mythology at the time of the Buddha, there was a demon known as Mara. And he was the force, he represents the force that worked toward delusion rather than awakening. So we could say that he was the embodiment or the personification of the hindrances. And as he would show up to try to seduce the Buddha or to distort his teachings of the Dharma, the Buddha would turn to Mara with a smile and say, "Mara, I see you." And as the story goes, he would even invite the demon for a cup of tea. Right? So this is based on the deep psychological insight that we don't get rid of our phobias and fears by avoidance. We have to face them. So really exposing ourselves and acknowledging what's happening in the mind. Of course, it's important here to mention, I think, that we don't want to overwhelm the system. We don't want to encounter triggers that may re-traumatize us if we have, deep psychological or emotional wounds. So it's really about finding the middle way between escaping and indulging, or between, suppressing and being carried away, right? So to continue the metaphor, which is also a method used in psychology, is that we may need to cut the demon up into digestible pieces so that we can begin to face them and integrate them. So with the power of mindfulness, we learn and we become able to be in the presence of this force without being carried away. And this is really important, and it's echoed also in modern neuroscience, that when emotions like fear or anger become strong enough, they really grip us, right? Our nervous system becomes agitated, aroused, and our subcortical part of our brain, they really take control. We lose conscious control of our behavior, of our feelings. But studies show that if we have the presence of mind to really step back and observe what's happening with clarity, then we can regain conscious control. By clearly perceiving what's happening, and most importantly, by accurately naming the feelings that emerges, the whole system can begin to calm down. It's like our highly evolved neurocortex comes back online, and it tells the subcortical part of our region that things are under control, things are okay. And then the glands in the brain and in the body start secreting neurotransmitters that enable the whole system to relax and calm down. And this is what Dan Siegel calls name it to tame it. We name the demon in order to tame it, that it loses its grip. So mindfulness has a natural way of removing the causes and conditions for the hindrances to manifest. It's a bit like darkness disappears as soon as the light is turned on, or the morning mist, it naturally dissolves or dissipates in the heat of the morning sun. The hindrances are kind of forced to move out of the mind in the presence of loving awareness. And the beautiful thing is that there's no real doing involved here. We don't actually have to do something. And this is what many of us find so counterintuitive. We feel that we have to kind of do something or to fix ourselves or to get rid of these unpleasant mind states. But actually the real power lies in the ability to step back and witness without acting. Right? Coming back to the water metaphor, the way to get rid of muddy water is not to stir it up or to do something. We simply have to let the water naturally settle, and then the bowl of water is naturally clear again. So when we can step back in this way and rest in awareness, we no longer feed these poisonous mind states. We can note what's happening without judgment, without identification, and paradoxically, when we're able to fully accept them as they are, these unwholesome mind states are allowed to pass through. Now, sometimes we need to take a more active approach. In contrast to embracing the hindrances and saying yes to them, the appropriate thing to do may also be to put up a strong defense, and to say no, right? Or even to, as sometimes said, to cut off the head of the hindrance, to cut off the head of the demon, right? If, for example, we find that criticism or self-doubt or confusion just keeps on coming up, we may need to be more firm and say, no, enough, right? To put up a resistance. So the wise response, again, it depends on the circumstances and also on our personal conditioning, actually. If we tend to be very self-critical, for example, we may need gentleness and loving awareness, loving kindness, metta. If we're the more indulgent type, we may need to be firm and use force and strength to kind of distance ourselves from the hindrance. So again, it comes down to wise discernment and of finding this middle way. We can also call upon what Joseph Goldstein calls our inner Dharma coach for some wise reflection. Let's say, for example, that we find ourselves caught in desire. We can invite some curiosity and ask ourselves, what keeps me hooked in this moment? What is it? What's going on? What is the cause of this craving or this attachment or this anger, confusion, whatever it is? And what would be a skillful response here? What am I longing for? What stands in the way of that? And it's not that we're looking for any particular answer to some problem, but it's that the process of inquiry itself can begin to awaken our curiosity and create space in the mind. The fifth and final step in the instruction is about knowing how to prevent the arising of hindrances. And just like there are preventative measures we can take to take care of our immune system and our body and our physical well-being that makes disease less likely to occur, there are things we can do to take care of our mind and our mental well-being to make these hindrances less likely to occur. And one way to look at mindfulness is as a guardian of the senses, right? By remaining vigilant and awake, we are less likely to be swept away by negative thoughts or emotions or feelings or beliefs or whatever it is. And again, this prevents the hindrances from, building nests in the mind, essentially. And once there is mindfulness present, we are reminded of our deeper intention and motivation to stay on the path. And even more importantly, we are reminded of how it feels like to be free. This is sati, to remember. So in a way, we could look at mindfulness as a way to strengthen our mental immune system, through meditation practice and cultivation of wholesome attitudes. Another such preventative measure is wise reflection. So, for example, if we experience strong lust or desire that is unhelpful, we can bring to mind and we can reflect on the impermanence and the nature of impermanence, or the aging of the body, or whatever we feel is helpful. And if we are experiencing strong anger or hatred or aggression, it may be helpful to bring to mind the reflection of gentleness, of loving kindness, of practicing metta as a way to counteract that ill will. Or we may bring to mind other reflections, like the importance of moderation, or the importance of surrounding ourselves with wise friends and teachers. So through the practice of meditation and wise reflection, mindfulness increasingly becomes our default mode. We build new habits so that when we encounter suffering, then the quality of loving kindness and compassion becomes our natural response. Or when we're caught up in defilements or destructive mind states, we increasingly see through them. We see the three marks of existence in them, and we're less likely to get caught. We can distance ourselves, and there's freedom. There's non-attachment. There's non-identification. So we have the awareness and the clarity of mind and the insight on the one hand. Remember, vipassana means insight. And then we have the compassion and the loving awareness, the loving kindness, the metta on the other. And these are really two sides of the same coin. These are the two wings that enable us to address, to acknowledge, and to work with the hindrances. Thanks for watching.